The Chernobyl disaster, was a nuclear accident that occurred on April 26, 1986, at the number 4 reactor in the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, near the city of Pripyat in the north of the Ukrainian SSR, in the Soviet Union. Called the world's worst ever civil nuclear incident, it is one of only 2 nuclear energy accidents rated at 7, the maximum severity, on the International Nuclear Event Scale, the other being the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan. The initial emergency response, together with later decontamination of the environment, involved more than 500,000 personnel and cost an estimated 18 billion rubles, roughly $68 billion in 2019, adjusted for inflation. The accident occurred during a safety test meant to measure the ability of the steam turbine to power the emergency feedwater pumps of an RBMK-type nuclear reactor in the event of a simultaneous loss of external power and major coolant leak. During a planned decrease of reactor power in preparation for the test, the operators accidentally dropped power output to near zero, due partially to xenon poisoning. While recovering from the power drop and stabilizing the reactor, the operators removed a number of control rods which exceeded limits set by the operating procedures. Upon test completion, the operators triggered a reactor shutdown. Due to a design flaw, this action resulted in localized increases in reactivity within the reactor, i.e., positive scram. That brought about the rupture of fuel channels and a rapid drop in pressure, thereby prompting the coolant to flash to steam. Neutron absorption thus dropped, leading to an increase in reactor activity, which further increased coolant temperatures, a positive feedback loop. This process led to steam explosions and the melting of the reactor core. The meltdown and explosions ruptured the reactor core and destroyed the reactor building. This was immediately followed by an open-air reactor core fire which lasted until May 4, 1986, during which airborne radioactive contaminants were released and deposited onto other parts of the USSR and Europe. Approximately 70% landed in Belarusia, now Belarus, 16 kilometers, 9.9 miles, away. The fire released about the same amount of radioactive material as the initial explosion. 3. In response to the initial accident, a 10-kilometer, 6.2 miles, radius exclusion zone was created 36 hours after the accident, from which approximately 49,000 people were evacuated, primarily from Pripyat. The exclusion zone was later increased to a radius of 30 kilometers, 19 miles, from which an additional 68,000 people were evacuated. Following the reactor explosion, which killed 2 engineers and severely burned 2 more, a secret emergency operation to put out the fire, stabilize the reactor, and clean up the ejected radioactive material began. During the immediate emergency response, 237 workers were hospitalized, of which 134 exhibited symptoms of acute radiation syndrome, ARS. Among those hospitalized, 28 died within the following 3 months, all of whom were hospitalized for ARS. In the following 10 years, 14 more workers, 9 who had been hospitalized with ARS, died of various causes, mostly unrelated to radiation exposure. The Soviet government engaged in a major cover-up of the disaster in 1986. When they finally acknowledged it, although without any details, the Telegraph Agency of the Soviet Union, TASS, then discussed the 3 Mile Island accident and other American nuclear accidents, which Serge Schmemann of the New York Times wrote was an example of the common Soviet tactic of whataboutism. The mention of a commission also indicated to observers the seriousness of the incident, and subsequent state radio broadcasts were replaced with classical music, which was a common method of preparing the public for an announcement of a tragedy in the USSR. Chernobyl's health effects to the general population are uncertain. An excess of 15 childhood thyroid cancer deaths were documented as of 2011. A United Nations committee found that to date fewer than 100 deaths have resulted from the fallout. Determining the total eventual number of exposure-related deaths is uncertain based on the linear no-threshold model, a contested statistical model, 15-16, model predictions of the eventual total death toll in the coming decades vary. The most widely cited studies by the World Health Organization predict an eventual 9,000 cancer-related fatalities in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Following the disaster, Pripyat was abandoned and eventually replaced by the new purpose-built city of Slavudik. The Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant sarcophagus was built by December 1986. It reduced the spread of radioactive contamination from the wreckage and protected it from weathering. The confinement shelter also provided radiological protection for the crews of the undamaged reactors at the site, which were restarted in late 1986 and 1987. However, this containment structure was only intended to last for 30 years, and required considerable reinforcement in the early 2000s. The shelter was heavily supplemented in 2017 by the Chernobyl New Safe Confinement, which was constructed around the old structure. This larger enclosure aims to enable the removal of both the sarcophagus and the reactor debris while containing the radioactive materials inside. Cleanup is scheduled for completion by 2065.